The death toll from Myanmar's recent 7.7 magnitude earthquake has surpassed 3,500, with the UN saying that number is likely to rise. The agency estimates more than 70 million people have been affected by the tragedy.
It adds the country's healthcare system is on the brink of collapse, unable to cope with the overwhelming number of victims. The destruction only adding to the suffering already brought on by years of civil war.
The quake was one of the strongest tremors to strike the country in a century. It toppled buildings, flattened entire communities, and left many without water, food, or shelter. Some 5,000 people are injured. More than 80% of buildings have reportedly been damaged, particularly in the major townships of Sagaing, Mandalay, and Magwe. Some structures that remain standing have been abandoned.
China says it's preparing to send an additional batch of humanitarian supplies, including prefabricated homes, operating rooms, and medicine. Despite post-quake ceasefires, fighting reportedly continues. The UNDP says it's received reports that the military has carried out at least 14 attacks since the pause began last week. The military says it will respond if its bases are attacked without reason.
Earlier, we spoke to Tom Andrews, UN Special Rapporteur to Myanmar, and Robina, Senior Human Rights Fellow at the Yale University Law School. They told us that how the conflict in Myanmar is affecting relief operations following the deadly earthquake.
This has been a disaster on top of a disaster. I mean, you had already 20 million people in need of humanitarian aid really before the earthquake hit. You have half the population falling under the poverty line before the earthquake hit. So you already had a very devastating situation in Myanmar, of course, exacerbated by the conflict that is raging across the country. Add to that this devastating earthquake. And what's happened in the past, of course, we've seen that the military junta has weaponized aid going into or trying to get into natural disasters. This is no exception. We've seen aid blockaded. We have had aid workers interrogated, extorted. We have a conscription program in which young people are terrified that they're going to be put into the military service when they try to provide help in this horrible situation. So it's a disaster on top of a disaster. On top of that, you had the military launching airstrikes, including in some of the areas most devastated by this earthquake. They declared a ceasefire finally after significant international pressure, but now we've been getting many, many reports of violations of that ceasefire and significant loss of life, not just from the earthquake, but now from these aerial attacks by the military.
Understood, Tom. I'm just wondering, though, given the challenges you've outlined and the history behind it, I'm wondering how the United Nations and all the aid bodies on the ground are trying to address these problems, trying to meet the challenges head on, despite, what you're facing on the ground and what the military has been doing?
Well, I think it's a multiple approach is required. Number one, I think those countries with any kind of relationship with a military junta have to be applying pressure on them to stop aerial attacks, to allow aid to get through to where it needs to go through. Secondly, we need to be taking aid and funneling it to those organizations and networks, those CSOs, those volunteer organizations, community organizations, village networks that exist out there that have connections to those areas most hard hit, that are not getting the aid that they need to. Those groups and networks need to be more fully resourced so that aid can get to where it needs to go. Listen, we've got millions of people in need of significant humanitarian aid. There's lack of food, lack of medicine, lack of clean water, lack of electricity. There are significant needs there. Hundreds of millions of dollars are going to be needed in order to deal with this crisis. We've got to get that aid in whatever way that we can, through formal channels, through informal channels. And I'm hoping that that's what we're going to be able to do in a much more effective way moving forward.
Tom, I can't help but feel that, you can't look at this crisis without the context of what's happened since the military coup back in February 2021. How would you describe events of the past 4 years, and where have they left the country?
It is a disaster. It's a very, very good question. I mean, as I mentioned, half the country has fallen into poverty. The military junta is losing ground, literally and figuratively. They've lost tens of thousands of troops to fatalities, surrender, defections. They now control about a third of the townships in Myanmar. So they've been losing ground steadily. The bad news is they have responded by escalating their attacks on villages. Their aerial attacks that we've been recording and tracking have actually increased over the last quarter. So as they become more desperate, as they lose more ground, they are increasing attacks on those who are the most vulnerable through both artillery attacks and aerial attacks from the sky.
With the recent quake only adding to the already monumental challenges that Myanmar is facing, do you see it will have any kind of impact on the regime itself, on Min Aung Hlaing, perhaps weaken his grip on power, or do you foresee him doubling down on military actions?
Well, it's a good question. Unfortunately, I would suggest probably the latter. If we look at the pattern, already he is committing himself to an election. He's talking about a so-called election happening in December. Of course, you can't have an election when you imprison and torture your political opponents. There are more than 20,000 political prisoners behind bars right now in the country. It's illegal for journalists to do what you're doing, reporting the truth. It's illegal to criticize the military junta openly. So these are obviously not conditions conducive to a free and fair election. But Min Aung Hlaing has allegedly been pushing forward, despite the fact that they lack control of most of the country, despite the conditions that I've just described, pushing forward to what he would hope, or is hoping, that the world would recognize as a free and fair election. And of course, it will be anything but. So I think he's doubling down, frankly, to answer your question. And I don't see any light at the tunnel, at least at this juncture.
That was Tom Andrews, who's UN Special Rapporteur to Myanmar. And we have more coverage on this crisis on our website, cna.asia. China, India, and other Southeast Asian nations, including Singapore, are among those that dispatch relief supplies, aiding in recovery efforts in quake-hit areas home to about 28 million people.